Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a mechanical analysis and kind of take a look at the arsenal as well of Bryan Woo. All right, so Bryan Woo has been one of the best pitchers in Major League Baseball the last 2 seasons. He had a streak of 25 starts with 6+ innings and 2 or fewer walks. Recently came to an end. You probably saw the clip. He was pretty upset about that, kind of thinking that he could have extended that streak a little bit, but he has been pretty lights out for the last 2 seasons. As a technically below average size Major League pitcher, let's talk about kind of first what lets him reach 98.7 miles an hour and an average of 95.7 miles an hour with his fastball. And then we'll kind of discuss what makes his arsenal so special too. So the reason I say technically undersized, the average Major League pitcher is about 6'3", 215. He's listed at 6'2", 205. So not a huge guy and still obviously throwing with a pretty impressive velocity. So the first thing that we want to look at is you'll see that kind of as he sets up and comes into his leg kick here, we're going to see him start to wind some tension right through that pelvis and rear hip. And so what you'll see, right, we're kind of seeing this little counter rotation back here, right, kind of relative external rotation of the femur there, or a relatively neutral femur because that pelvis is also kind of counter-rotating. And what you can't necessarily see from this angle that we'll see from the side a little bit better is that we're getting kind of that pelvis that kind of tucking under into that kind of posterior tilt. And so we can see it kind of as he comes through here, right, kind of winding that tension. The other thing that you'll kind of notice, and you can notice really well from this kind of side view, is that center of mass shift. So as we're kind of reaching that peak leg lift, how far we've moved away from the rubber. And so it's a little bit harder to tell because the camera is also moving as he goes. But what you can kind of see is if we were truly kind of side on from third base, you'd be able to see kind of that belly button or the tip of his hat kind of moving forward of the rubber. So pretty good center of mass shift, kind of setting up that potential energy and the ability to take advantage of that, kind of like we've talked about before, similar to the principle kind of going into a depth jump. And so what you'll kind of see is he's kind of winding tension through this rear leg. So a more externally rotated guy than others, right? So he's a more externally rotated guy. So he's winding tension through, kind of some of that relative external rotation. He's going to have a more vertical shin than others. And that's kind of how he's taking slack out to kind of create this stretch that he's then going to unwind into foot strike. And so what you're going to see is as he goes down the mound, he's using a similar strategy to what you might see like Aroldis Chapman use. So this lead leg is extended. And so what he's essentially doing is he's using that, to kind of counterbalance himself so he can keep his trunk relatively stacked and he can stay in that hinge a little bit longer. So some coaches, have a stylistic issue with this for some reason. I'm not exactly sure what that would be, but essentially this is super effective for him. So anybody kind of talking about, that leg is swinging, and I guess in some cases that could happen if this extended leg just kind of swung open. But for him, it's a mechanism to kind of wind and hold that tension in that kind of hinge as he goes down the mound. So you kind of see, right, kind of holding full foot contact there, really, really, really winding tension really well into that back hip, and then we're going to see them kind of open very abruptly into foot strike. And so what you'll kind of see is that he strikes from above, right? So we're not rolling into foot contact. He's going to get above there and then snap into ground contact, which is what you want to see. One of the things, one of the problematic things that you can sometimes see with guys is if they get kind of that toe first type of landing and they're kind of going forward, sliding into that front foot contact, we don't get as clean of a block as we may otherwise get. So really good job of him, there kind of setting himself up. And this kind of leads us nicely into the next piece is that, what does this hip-shoulder separation look like? This is maybe the piece that he's kind of arguably most well known for mechanically. And that is kind of winding that tension, creating this really big stretch here. So what he's essentially doing is getting a big stretch to that kind of anterior oblique sling. What we're also seeing, right, a good stretch across that shoulder complex and kind of, maybe most notably the pec, but there's certainly a lot going on there. And then what we're going to see is he's going to come into some thoracic extension as well. He does a really good job of that, kind of using that spine like a wave. And what you're going to see is he begins that big pull from behind with the arm. So segments the shoulder complex from the torso really nicely. And we get a really, really good pull kind of from back here all the way through ball release. So you're going to see kind of that arm begin its layback back here. We're going to get that nice long pull the whole way through. So that's really, really clean there. I think that's one of the things that he's kind of really known for is getting, pretty big, quote unquote, hip shoulder separation. But what you're seeing is kind of the well-timed and well-sequenced delivery. Right? We've talked about this before, but more hip-shoulder separation isn't necessarily a good thing kind of in an absolute sense. What we're looking for is, where can you go as an individual and kind of maximize that stretch and that elastic response you're going to get from that. And for him, he does a really good job of kind of finding where that is, right? It's kind of hard to argue with, almost 99 miles an hour that he, isn't doing a pretty good job. So some things he does really well there. So I think the next piece, right, let's talk about that arm swing. Right, so pretty smooth and relaxed the whole way through. No hitches or breaks kind of through there. Those would be the things that would kind of get flagged if we saw kind of any stopping or stabbing or anything like that. But he's pretty smooth through there. You'll be able to see this a little bit better kind of from the back as we go. But nice and smooth, right into flip up. We're certainly on time at foot strike, right? What we're looking for is anywhere from kind of 45 to 90. So he's well within there, call that, probably 75, 80 degrees. Pretty good there. So very, very much on time, and we could see kind of this big stretch that's happening here. Getting a big stretch across that musculature and that connective tissue as well. So we're going to get that, really aggressive response and reflexive kind of pull through the zone there. So we talked about kind of the smoothness of the arm swing and that spiral up through. Kind of the next piece here would be, what does the arm look like in terms of, are we driving kind of through the plane of upper torso rotation? And yeah, we got pretty clean right here. So we're capturing that rotational energy and transferring it really, really well into the ball. So that's another thing that he does pretty well. What you're going to see is he also is pretty aggressive with that forward flexion of the torso kind of as a whole into ball release. And so that's, reminiscent of somebody maybe like a Tyler Glasnow, who's kind of really aggressively getting through there, or a Aroldis Chapman to some degree, certainly this year. So really good job kind of capturing all of that energy and aggressively getting through ball release there. I think, maybe to briefly talk about one of the things that he could do a little bit better that maybe we could see, from the side, is that while we stay stacked, we get in a pretty good position here. What you're going to see is he doesn't necessarily aggressively reverse direction like we might see from others. So this isn't just about knee extension, but it's about, do we get that aggressive co-contraction at the ankle, knee, and hip, have that stability, and then can we redirect force against the direction of the throw? And I would argue that, his could be, improved some. Would I necessarily make that change right now while he's pitching so well, or try to do that in season? Absolutely not. Right, he's performing at an elite level, so he doesn't necessarily need to do much right now in the way of that. I think, maybe down the line, if there were performance issues or something along those lines, then I might look here. But for the time being, obviously, I'm not suggesting he should change anything because he is, pitching so well and at an elite level. So, kind of from a mechanical standpoint, Bryan Woo does a bunch of things, exceptionally well. That you would look for as like kind of a principle. If you were taking a principle take, in terms of what throwing mechanics should look like. Does a great job of kind of setting up that center of mass shift, winds tension through his pelvis, unwinds it aggressively into foot strike, strikes from above, sets up his hip-shoulder separation to kind of create that big stretch through that whole sling and up through the arm, transfers energy rotationally into the ball, really well. So one of the things that you see is, kind of how the glove arm, works in rhythm with the throwing arm and the lead leg, right? So you see that handbrake kind of happening, pretty much where you'd expect at the top of the delivery, right? In rhythm going down, works in conjunction with the throwing arm, kind of creating that tension across the upper body. That's then going to be pulled through, and the glove arm then stops, gives us that kind of firm point along with that that glove arm side to kind of rotate around. We get that stiffening as we rotate around through ball release. So nice job there. But yeah, I think, kind of the biggest thing when it comes to Bryan Woo that people recognize is his elite fastball. And so what we're kind of seeing from that are some pretty crazy numbers. So a whiff rate of 29.5% on the four seam. It's top 4 in starters. An xWOBA of 246, so it's the lowest of all pitchers on the four seam. What makes it really special is kind of the low release point. So just over 5 feet release height. It's the lowest in the third lowest in the league. Even though he's 6'2", and then he's got a negative 3.7 degree vertical approach angle. So what we're seeing with the fastball is that he doesn't have outlier characteristics necessarily in terms of induced vertical break or things like that. But what you're seeing are these crazy traits in terms of how he's releasing it, and then this very, very flat approach angle that means hitters don't pick it up very well. It doesn't align well in terms of kind of the bat path and all of these things. And it just gets on guys really fast. You kind of see the ball exploding out of his hand that you might see from somebody with, kind of these super high IVB numbers and, more aggressive extension. But that's kind of the really big thing for him is, the fastball usage. He does a really good job he's constantly throwing it in the zone. So, part of the reason he's able to have this kind of streak of 6 innings plus with 2 walks or less is that he can hang around in these games because his pitch count stays really low because he's constantly in and around the zone, challenging guys with the fastball as well as other pitches. One of the really interesting things about his arsenal is that he throws a seam-shifted wake sinker. And this is, something that a bunch of guys throw. That's not necessarily unique. What is unique is that he pairs that with, a quote-unquote rising fastball. And this is a little bit unusual because the seam-shifted wake sinker tends to go with guys who bias, a bit towards supination. And those guys tend not to be able to kind of throw these, true fastballs that have kind of that rising component because of the clean backspin and super efficient spin that those tend to have. Supination bias guys tend not to be able to do that. So the fact that he can throw that sinker along with the rising, quote unquote, four-seamer is pretty impressive and gives him a unique arsenal, which again, when we're looking at, pitchers who have outlier success, typically they're going to have some type of outlier quality, right? That kind of leads to that. That probably goes without saying. But having an arsenal as unique as his is part of what makes him special, along with the velocity, which, with the seam-shifted wake sinker, is still averages at 95 miles an hour. So still pretty high velocity for a pitch moving the way it does. And again, it's released almost identically to the four-seamer, but with, very different ball flight metrics. So, nearly 17 inches to the arm side. So, very different path that kind of hitters are looking at. So an interesting pairing for sure. Moving on to his sweeper, one of the things that makes it really interesting is, not just the velocity, because he throws it pretty hard, almost 84 miles an hour, while having nearly 14 inches of horizontal break. It's also got 6 inches of IVB to it. So an interesting pitch. Again, guys like Tyler Rogers and people like that are kind of known to throw these, but it does seem to have an interesting effect on hitters. So just again, a super interesting arsenal from him. Those are kind of the main ones. And along with the velocity numbers, just having an awesome season. So thanks for watching, guys. If you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Feel free to reach out via email. But if you like these, we'll kind of keep doing the mechanical and arsenal breakdowns, and we'll do different guys. So if you have somebody you're interested in, feel free to drop that below.
Pitch number 10, and he puts them away, nearly stumbling on top of home plate. A rising fastball up and in. That's the 8th punch out from Bryan Woo, who finally wins that battle.
Just when you think